welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the complete timeline of Stranger Things, the intertwined tale of small-town innocence and supernatural terror that began in the hidden laboratories of Cold War paranoia, only to unfold into a saga of friendship tested by darkness, government conspiracies that shattered lives, and dimensions colliding in ways that transformed a quiet Indiana town into ground zero for horrors beyond comprehension. Born in the covert experiments of the 1950s, where the boundaries between science and torture blurred in the name of national security, it grew into a web of psychic children, parallel dimensions, and creatures that defied natural law. But beneath the surface-level scares lurked deeper currents, the bonds of childhood pushed to their limits, families fractured by secrets and sacrifice, and a persistent evil wearing many faces across decades, from government operative to interdimensional predator to something far more ancient and malevolent. From Terry Ives's stolen daughter and the Hawkins Laboratories' unethical pursuits to Will Byers' vanishing into shadow and the Mind Flayer's calculated invasions to the Russian infiltration beneath Starcourt Mall and the revelation of Vecna's true identity as Henry Creel, the boy who became one, who became the architect of the Upside Down's nightmare, will trace every thread of this intricate history step by step. This is the story of how a Dungeons & Dragons campaign became prophecy, how a girl with a shaved head and bleeding nose became humanity's defender, and how the innocence of the 1980s was stripped away to reveal the monsters that had always been watching from the other side. Whether you're discovering these details for the first time, letting familiar moments pull you deeper into rest, or simply allowing the tale to wash over you like a gentle fog as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the full, unbroken timeline of Stranger Things. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet wonder to see the same story weaving through different corners of the world, one hushed night at a time. Let's begin. In the tense atmosphere of the 1950s, when the Cold War cast long shadows over American society and the government sought every possible advantage against Soviet threats, the seeds of Hawkins's future nightmares were planted in the sterile corridors of covert research facilities. The Central Intelligence Agency, driven by fears of communist brainwashing techniques and desperate to unlock the untapped potential of the human mind, initiated Project MK-Ultra, a sprawling program of psychological experiments that stretched across numerous institutions, testing the limits of consciousness through sensory deprivation, hallucinogenic drugs, and techniques that bordered on torture. Among the many facilities conducting this research stood Hawkins National Laboratory, an unassuming building in rural Indiana that would become the epicenter of events that defied natural explanation. Dr. Martin Brenner, a scientist whose calm demeanor masked an obsessive drive to push beyond ethical boundaries, led the research at Hawkins Lab, focusing specifically on unlocking psychic abilities in human subjects, particularly through the use of LSD and other mind-altering substances combined with sensory deprivation tanks and psychological manipulation. His methods, clinical and detached, treated subjects not as people, but as data points in humanity's evolution towards something greater, or so he justified to himself in the quiet hours between experiments. In the summer of 1969, as the nation watched Armstrong walk on the moon and Woodstock promised a countercultural awakening, a young woman named Terry Ives answered an advertisement seeking volunteers for a government study, drawn by the promise of payment and the vague description of contributing to scientific advancement. Terry, bright-eyed and trusting, arrived at Hawkins Laboratory alongside other volunteers, unaware that Dr. Brenner's experiments would fundamentally alter the course of her existence. The test began innocuously enough, questionnaires and physical examinations, but soon progressed to sessions in sensory deprivation tanks where hallucinogens dissolved the boundaries of Terry's perception. opening her mind to vistas of possibility that Brenner monitored with cold fascination. Terry proved to be an exceptional subject, her mind responding to the treatments in ways that suggested genuine psychokinetic potential. The ability to move objects with thought, to perceive distant events, to touch other minds across space. Yet, as the sessions intensified, Terry discovered she was pregnant, a development that should have ended her participation, but instead transformed her into something far more valuable to Brenner's research, an opportunity to study whether psychic abilities could be inherited or even enhanced in utero through continued experimentation on the mother. Despite Terry's growing discomfort and attempts to withdraw from the program, Brenner insisted the research continue, his reassurances masking a determination that bordered on fanaticism. Throughout her pregnancy, Terry underwent treatment after treatment, her unborn child bathed in the chemical cocktails and electromagnetic frequencies that Brenner hypothesized might unlock dormant human potential. On an undisclosed date in 1971, Terry gave birth to a daughter, a moment that should have marked the beginning of motherhood, but instead became the catalyst for Terry's complete destruction. In the hours after delivery, as Terry held her newborn and felt the overwhelming rush of maternal love, Dr. Brenner enacted a plan of breathtaking cruelty. He declared the child stillborn, removed the infant from Terry's arms despite her protests, and initiated a series of electroshock treatments designed to erase Terry's memories of the pregnancy altogether, fragmenting her mind so thoroughly that she could never pose a threat to his continued research on the child. The baby, designated Subject 11 for being the 11th child in Brenner's expanded program of psychic development, was raised within the laboratory's walls, never knowing the mother who fought desperately to reclaim her, while Terry, her mind shattered by the forced amnesia, spent years trying to piece together the truth that flickered at the edges of her damaged consciousness. Terry's sister Becky watched helplessly as her sibling descended into what doctors termed a psychotic break, a diagnosis that conveniently explained away Terry's insistence that her daughter lived, that the government had stolen her child, that somewhere in Hawkins' laboratory a little girl with Terry's eyes was being subjected to experiments that would make MK Ultra's original sins pale in comparison. Terry's attempts to reclaim her daughter grew increasingly desperate over the following years, hiring lawyers, confronting Hawkins Lab staff until a final tragic attempt to rescue 11 in the mid-1970s resulted in Terry being captured and subjected to such intensive electroshock therapy that her mind retreated entirely, leaving her body in a catatonic state where she endlessly relived fragmented memories in a loop. Her consciousness trapped in the moment of loss, repeating the words, "Breathe, sunflower, rainbow, 3 to the right, 4 to the left, 450," like a mantra that held the shattered pieces of her identity together. This fate, a living death that preserved Terry's body while destroying herself, represented the ultimate consequence of Brenner's ruthless pursuit of knowledge. A woman sacrificed on the altar of scientific ambition and government secrecy. While Terry existed in her fractured state throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, her daughter grew within the confines of Hawkins' laboratory, knowing nothing of sunlight or freedom, raised in a world of white walls, monitoring equipment, and Dr. Brenner's paternal yet manipulative presence. The girl, who knew herself only as 11, shared the laboratory with other children, each identified by numbers tattooed on their wrists, each possessing abilities that Brenner cultivated through a mixture of encouragement and punishment. Among these children, a boy designated as one stood apart, older than the others, serving as a kind of orderly and assistant to Brenner, his presence a constant in the laboratory's routines, though the other children sensed something different about him, a depth of power that the younger subjects couldn't quite comprehend. Eleven's abilities manifested early and powerfully: telekinesis that could shatter glass and crush metal, remote viewing that allowed her to perceive distant locations as if standing within them, and eventually, as Brenner's experiments intensified, the capacity to access other dimensions of existence that conventional physics insisted were impossible. The children's daily existence followed rigid patterns: mornings in individual cells, barely more than concrete rooms with a bed and a surveillance camera. Afternoons in the Rainbow Room, a playroom painted in cheerful colors that belied the clinical observations taking place. And testing sessions where Brenner, whom the children called Papa, pushed them to extend their abilities through exercises that grew increasingly demanding and dangerous. For minor infractions or failures to meet expectations, children were confined to isolation chambers, sensory deprivation that echoed the techniques used on Terry years earlier, or subjected to electroshock collar punishments that conditioned compliance through pain. One served as a mediator between Brenner and the children, his gentle demeanor and understanding seeming to offer respite from Papa's cold assessments, creating a bond with Eleven that would prove to be far more complex and sinister than the girl could imagine in her limited understanding of human relationships. The early 1980s marked an escalation in Brenner's ambitions as Eleven's powers reached levels that surpassed all other subjects. In 1983, during a particularly invasive experiment, Brenner directed Eleven to use her remote viewing abilities to spy on a Russian agent. Her consciousness projected across thousands of miles to observe the target in his private chambers. Eleven succeeded, but in that distant observation, she encountered something that shattered the boundaries of Brenner's understanding. A creature, tall and faceless, existing in a space that overlaid the Russian's room like a photograph's negative. A dimension of decay and darkness that mirrored our world, yet twisted it into nightmare. The shock of this encounter caused Eleven to recoil, but Brenner, recognizing the implications, immediately shifted his focus from psychic espionage to dimensional exploration, theorizing that Eleven had glimpsed a parallel dimension, a place that existed alongside our reality, separated by barriers that psychic energy could potentially breach. In a subsequent experiment that would alter Hawkins' fate forever, Brenner instructed Eleven to make contact with the creature she had sensed, to reach out and touch it through her abilities despite Eleven's terror and reluctance. Driven by a mixture of obedience to Papa and curiosity about the entity, Eleven extended her consciousness into that dark reflection, and in the moment of contact, the boundaries between dimensions tore open. The creature, which would come to be known as the Demogorgon for its resemblance to the multi-headed monster from Dungeons and Dragons, existed in what the laboratory staff would designate Dimension X, though locals would eventually call it the Upside Down for its inverted, decaying mirror of Hawkins. The dimensional rift, a rupture in reality itself, manifested in the laboratory's basement, a swirling gateway that pulsed with otherworldly energy and allowed the Demogorgon passage into our world. In the chaos that followed, as alarms blared and staff scrambled to contain the breach, Eleven, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had done and driven by an instinct for survival that finally overcame years of conditioning, used her abilities to shatter the locks on her cell and escape into the rainy November night, barefoot and wearing only a hospital gown, running into a world she had never known, pursued by laboratory security and unknowingly carrying the key to understanding the darkness that now had a foothold in Hawkins. The gate that Eleven's contact created wasn't merely a temporary rupture, but a permanent wound in the fabric between dimensions, a fissure that Brenner's team would spend years studying and attempting to control, though they fundamentally misunderstood its nature and the intelligence that lurked on the other side. The Upside Down itself existed as a dark reflection of Hawkins, frozen perpetually at the moment of the gate's creation on November 6, 1983, its landscape consisting of the same buildings, streets, and forests as the town above, but rendered in decay, draped in creeping vines and floating spores, lit by an eternal twilight and crackling with red lightning that split skies empty of sun or stars. The atmosphere carried a toxic quality, breathable but hostile, while the flora and fauna consisted of grotesque mockeries of earthly life, tendrils that moved with predatory intent, and organisms that served as extensions of a vast, malevolent consciousness that would later reveal itself as the Mind Flayer, a being of such immense power and alien intelligence that its true form defied human comprehension. On the night of November 6, 1983, as Eleven fled into the woods surrounding Hawkins' laboratory, a 12-year-old boy named Will Byers pedaled his bicycle home from a friend's house. his mind filled with thoughts of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns and the simple joys of childhood in a small town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Will, sensitive and artistic, closer to his mother Joyce than many boys his age, took his usual route through the dark roads near Mirkwood, the forest area that he and his friends had named after Tolkien's perilous woodland. As he rode, singing softly to himself, the streetlights flickered and died in sequence, plunging the road into darkness that felt somehow alive and watching. From the woods emerged a creature that shouldn't exist, the Demogorgon, its face a flower of teeth that opened to release an unearthly scream, drawn to Will by mechanisms that wouldn't be understood for years, perhaps by his fear, perhaps by simple proximity to the gate, or perhaps by something deeper, a sensitivity to the dimensional barriers that made Will particularly visible to the creature's alien senses. Will, terrified, pedaled frantically toward his house, the creature pursuing through the woods with impossible speed, its gangly form moving between trees with predatory grace. Reaching his home, Will burst through the door, calling for his mother, who was working a late shift, finding only empty rooms and growing darkness. The phone line crackled with interference when he tried to call for help, the Demogorgon's presence disrupting electronics as it approached. In desperation, Will ran to the shed behind the house, loading his father's rifle with trembling hands, chambering around as the door burst open and the creature filled the doorway, its roar shaking the small structure. Will fired, but the bullet passed through the creature as if it were smoke, and in the next instant, the Demogorgon seized him, and the world inverted, reality peeling away to reveal the cold, dark mirror of the Upside Down. Will found himself in his shed, but wrong, covered in vines and rot, the air thick with spores, and through the walls he could see his mother arriving home in the real world, calling his name, just feet away, yet separated by dimensional barriers he couldn't breach, his screams unheard as the creature dragged him deeper into that nightmare realm. Joyce Byers, arriving home to find Will's bike abandoned in the road and the house empty, immediately knew something terrible had occurred, a mother's instinct screaming that this was no ordinary absence. As the hours passed and dawn broke without Will's return, Joyce contacted Police Chief Jim Hopper, a man carrying his own grief from the loss of his daughter years earlier to cancer, a tragedy that had dissolved his marriage and driven him to bury his pain in pills and alcohol while maintaining order in a town where the most serious crimes were typically drunk driving and teenage vandalism. Hopper, initially treating Will's disappearance as a runaway case or perhaps an accident in the woods, organized search parties that combed the forests around Hawkins, unaware that the boy they sought existed just beyond the veil of reality, trapped in a dimension that defied their understanding of possible. Will's friends, Mike Wheeler, Dustin Henderson, and Lucas Sinclair, refused to accept the adults' reassurances that Will would turn up safely, instead launching their own investigation, riding their bikes through Hawkins' streets at night, calling Will's name into the darkness. On one such search, cycling through the woods near the laboratory in a cold rain, the boys encountered a bizarre sight. A girl, rail-thin and shivering, head-shaved, wearing a hospital gown, and looking at them with eyes that held both terror and something else, a power that made the air feel heavy around her. This was 11 days into her escape, surviving on stolen food and shelter in abandoned buildings, her abilities having kept her alive, but her complete lack of knowledge about the world leaving her vulnerable and lost. When the boys approached, 11's first instinct was to flee, but Mike, seeing her distress and cold, offered his jacket and a promise of help, an act of kindness that would forge a bond deeper than any of them could anticipate. Mike smuggled 11 into his basement, hiding her from his parents and introducing her to his friends, who quickly recognized that this strange girl possessed abilities that defied explanation, demonstrated when she telekinetically slammed a door shut to prevent them from sending her back into the rain. Through halting communication, 11, whose vocabulary was limited and who knew nothing of social norms, revealed fragments of her existence. The laboratory, Papa, the experiments, and most crucially, when shown a photo of Will, she confirmed, "I know him," pointing to the Wheeler's Dungeons and Dragons board and placing Will's game piece on the depiction of the Veil of Shadows, a dark reflection of their fantasy world. This connection, combined with Eleven's demonstration of remote viewing, by channeling Will's voice through Mike's walkie-talkie, speaking his desperate message, "Mom, I'm here, I'm right here," convinced the boys that Eleven represented their best hope of finding their missing friend, though they couldn't yet comprehend the full scope of what her presence in their lives would mean. As the boys integrated Eleven into their group, dressing her in Mike's sister Nancy's old clothes and a blonde wig to disguise her appearance, teaching her about friendship, promises, and the concept of trust through the framework of their Dungeons and Dragons games where parties stood together against impossible odds, Joyce Byers descended into a state that others interpreted as a breakdown but was actually a desperate, intuitive, grasping toward truth. The lights in her home began to flicker and pulse in patterns that seemed responsive, as if something was trying to communicate through the electrical system. Joyce, rather than dismiss these phenomena as grief-induced hallucinations, leaned into them, speaking to the lights, asking, "Will, is that you?" and receiving responses, bulbs brightening for yes, dimming for no. A crude but functional communication channel that defied everything Hawkins residents believed about reality. When the entity, Will trapped in the upside down and reaching out through the thin barriers that electricity could somehow bridge, spelled out RUN in Christmas lights that Joyce frantically strung across her living room wall, she understood that her son existed somewhere terrible, somewhere close yet unreachable, and that something predatory was hunting him in that dark place. Joyce's insistence that Will was alive, that he was communicating through lights and electronics, that something supernatural was occurring, met with skepticism from nearly everyone except Hopper, whose investigation had uncovered inconsistencies that suggested a cover-up. Government agents lurking at search sites, laboratory personnel asking questions about the search, and a body pulled from the quarry that was identified as Will, but which Hopper's instincts told him was wrong somehow. Hopper's suspicions, honed by years of police work and sharpened by his refusal to let another child be lost on his watch, drove him to break into Hawkins' laboratory after hours, discovering levels of security far beyond what a research facility should require and glimpsing before being discovered and forcibly drugged, equipment and documentation that suggested the laboratory's work extended far beyond the energy research they claimed to conduct. Meanwhile, in the Upside Down, Will Byers survived against impossible odds, evading the Demogorgon through a combination of hiding in Castle Byers, the fort he had built in the woods which existed in both dimensions, and sheer desperate cunning. The dimension slowly killed him, its atmosphere toxic over prolonged exposure, its cold sapping his strength, but Will's connection to his mother manifested through his ability to somehow reach through the dimensional barriers to electronics in the real world provided hope and purpose. When he sang "Should I Stay or Should I Go?", his and Jonathan's favorite song, the music transmitted faintly into the real world, a ghost signal that Joyce detected and clung to as proof of her son's existence in that unreachable somewhere. The boys' investigation, guided by Eleven's fragmented knowledge and her abilities, led them to discover the gate's location within Hawkins' laboratory, though their attempt to infiltrate the facility ended in chaos when government agents, under Brenner's orders to recapture Eleven at any cost, pursued them through the woods. In a moment of protective fury, Eleven used her powers to flip a government van that was bearing down on the boys, the vehicle rolling through the air like a toy, demonstrating both the staggering extent of her abilities and the physical toll they exacted, blood streaming from her nose as the effort drained her. This incident forced the boys and Eleven into hiding at the Wheelers' home, where Mike, recognizing the danger Eleven faced from those hunting her, promised, "I will protect you no matter what." A vow that deepened the bond forming between the traumatized girl who had never known genuine affection and the boy who saw past her powers to the frightened child within. As November progressed and Will's time in the Upside Down stretched beyond a week, his survival growing increasingly improbable, Multiple investigations converged. Joyce and Hopper, now working together after Hopper's break-in, convinced him of the laboratory's involvement, confronted Brenner, and demanded answers, leading to a tense negotiation where Brenner, recognizing that containment had failed, agreed to let them attempt a rescue through the gate in exchange for their silence. Nancy Wheeler and Jonathan Byers, brought together by shared loss. Nancy's best friend Barb having vanished the same night as Will during a party at Steve Harrington's pool, unknowingly taken by the Demogorgon when she cut her hand and the blood drew the creature, discovered evidence in the woods of a portal, a temporary rift through which the Demogorgon traveled, and made contact with the Upside Down themselves, hearing the creature's approach and barely escaping. And the boys, with Eleven's guidance, prepared for a final confrontation, understanding through her warnings that the gate was the key to everything. The convergence came at Hawkins Middle School, where the boys had arranged to meet and plan their assault on the laboratory, only to be ambushed by government agents who had tracked them through surveillance and informants. In the gymnasium, as agents closed in and Dr. Brenner himself appeared, calling 11 come home, using the paternal manipulation that had controlled her for years, 11 made a choice that defined her transformation from subject to person. She fought back. Using her abilities with a fury born from years of captivity and newfound understanding of friendship's worth, 11 systematically killed or incapacitated every agent in the building. Bodies flying, bones snapping, the girl at the center of the carnage standing with blood streaming from her nose and eyes. The physical manifestation of the power burning through her. When Brenner approached, still calling her back to his control, 11 declared with simple finality, no, and the Demogorgon, drawn by the psychic energy and blood, burst through the gymnasium wall, seizing Brenner and dragging him away, fate unknown but presumed fatal, a fitting end for the man who had orchestrated so much suffering in pursuit of his grand experiments. With the path to the gate open and time running out, Joyce and Hopper, equipped with hazmat suits and breathing apparatus, descended through the gate in the laboratory's basement, passing through a membrane that felt like pushing through thick, organic tissue, emerging into the Upside Down's nightmare landscape. Following Joyce's maternal intuition and the faint signals she had been receiving, they navigated the dark mirror of Hawkins, finding Castle Byers where Will lay unconscious, a tendril from the Upside Down forced down his throat, pumping the dimension's toxic atmosphere directly into his lungs, the slug-like appendage retracting and leaving Will barely alive, his body cold and pulse thready. They carried him back through the gate, racing against the dimension's grip on his life, while simultaneously, in the real Hawkins, the boys and 11 faced the Demogorgon's final assault at Mike's house, the creature smashing through walls in its hunt for them, driven by an intelligence that targeted 11 specifically, as if recognizing her as the architect of its freedom and the greatest threat to its continued existence. In the Wheelers' basement, as the Demogorgon cornered them and the boys' makeshift weapons, slingshots and bats, proved useless against its otherworldly hide, 11 stepped forward, placing herself between the creature and her friends. In a demonstration of power that went beyond anything she had shown before, 11 engaged the Demogorgon in psychic combat, the two beings locked in a contest of will and energy that shattered windows and cracked walls, the girl screaming with effort as she first halted the creature's advance, then forced it backward, and finally, in an eruption of power that disintegrated the Demogorgon's form into ash and scattered particles, vanished along with the creature, the energy expenditure so total that 11 seemed to dissolve into the same drifting fragments, leaving only silence and her friends' anguished calls of her name echoing in the empty basement. In the immediate aftermath, as December brought snow to Hawkins and the town attempted to return to normalcy under a blanket of government cover stories, mandatory non-disclosure agreements, and compensation payments to those who had been affected, Will Byers recovered in Hawkins General Hospital, his survival deemed miraculous by doctors who couldn't explain the exotic toxins in his system or the minor hypothermia that should have been fatal after so long in the cold. Joyce remained at his bedside constantly. While Jonathan and Will's stepfather Bob Newby took turns keeping vigil, the family reunited but marked by the ordeal in ways that would only become apparent over time. Hopper, elevated to a reluctant hero in the town's eyes for finding Will, though the official story attributed the kidnapping to a disturbed individual now deceased, bore the weight of knowledge he couldn't share, understanding that Hawkins sat atop a dimensional rift that remained open in the laboratory's basement, monitored but not sealed. A wound in reality that the government showed no inclination to heal, only to study. The boys welcomed Will back into their group with fierce protective joy, though they noticed small changes in their friend, moments where Will seemed distant, a haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, a reluctance to discuss what he had experienced in the Upside Down beyond the basics of hiding and fear. Mike, dealing with the loss of Eleven by maintaining her room in his basement as a kind of shrine, spoke to her nightly over his walkie-talkie, recounting his day and promising, "I'm not giving up on you, I'm never giving up on you." Messages that transmitted into static and silence, but which represented a faith that she existed somewhere, somehow waiting to return. Nancy, grieving Barb's death and burdened by guilt that she had been with Steve instead of noticing her friend's disappearance, pursued a dangerous path of demanding answers from the laboratory, threatening to expose the truth despite the risks, until Hopper negotiated a compromise. Justice for Barb's family through a fabricated story that provided closure without revealing the reality of what had claimed her. As Christmas approached and Hawkins settled under the comfortable lie that everything had returned to normal, subtle signs suggested otherwise. Joyce reported that Will sometimes seemed to go away, spacing out for minutes at a time, returning with no memory of the gap. Hopper, visiting the woods around the laboratory, discovered pumpkin patches rotting ahead of schedule, the decay spreading in patterns that centered on the lab. And in the Upside Down, unseen by any living person, the dimension continued its existence. The landscape now marked by Eleven's presence, particles of her scattered through the dark realm, slowly coalescing in ways that suggested the girl's energy hadn't been destroyed but rather dispersed, awaiting circumstances that might allow reformation. Most ominously, the gate itself pulsed with increasing frequency, the dimensional barriers growing thinner with each cycle, allowing not just the passage of a single predatory creature, but potentially opening the way for something far larger and more intelligent, an entity that had noticed the breach and was beginning to extend its influence through, preparing for an invasion that would make the Demogorgon's predation seem like a mere scouting mission in comparison. The relative peace of winter and spring shattered in the summer of 1984 when Will began experiencing what Joyce initially dismissed as post-traumatic episodes, but which were actually something far more sinister. Visions of the Upside Down. Flashes where reality peeled away to reveal the dark dimension, often triggered by stress or cold, but growing more frequent and lasting longer with each occurrence. On Halloween, a particularly intense episode during trick-or-treating left Will frozen in terror, staring at a sky that only he could see, watching massive clouds forming into a shape that suggested something colossal and spider-like, towering over the dimension's landscape, its presence filling Will with a dread so profound that he collapsed, pulled back to reality only by his friend's shouts and Joyce's embrace. Dr. Owens, the new head of operations at Hawkins Laboratory following Brenner's presumed death, took over Will's medical care, running tests that revealed disturbing anomalies in Will's neurological activity and body temperature, patterns that suggested something foreign in his system. Though Owens downplayed the findings to Joyce, insisting Will simply needed time to process his trauma. Unknown to Joyce or Owens at this stage, Will's time in the Upside Down had left him fundamentally changed, infected by the dimension itself through the tendril that had invaded his body, planting seeds of the Mind Flayer's consciousness that now gestated within him, a connection that allowed the vast intelligence behind the Upside Down to see through Will's eyes, to experience the real world through his senses. Gathering intelligence for the invasion, it was orchestrating. The Mind Flayer, a being of pure malevolence that existed as something between individual entity and hive consciousness, operated with cold calculation, understanding that brute force through the gate would be met with resistance, but that infiltration, possession, and the corruption of Hawkins from within might succeed where direct assault would fail. Will represented the perfect first domino, a boy already touched by the upside down, his dimensional barriers weakened, his psychology marked by trauma that made him vulnerable to the Mind Flayer's whispers in the dark. While Will's condition deteriorated, 11 existed in her own form of captivity, having emerged from the upside down through means she couldn't fully explain or remember. Finding herself in the woods beyond Hawkins, hunted by residual government agents and weak from her ordeal. Hopper, who had been leaving food in a box in the woods as a desperate hope that 11 might still live, discovered her and made a decision that balanced protection with isolation. He brought her to his grandfather's old cabin, a structure hidden deep in the forest, off any official records, and established her there in secret, becoming her guardian and jailer simultaneously. For months, 11 lived in the cabin, learning to read through Hopper's books, watching television that became her window to a world she couldn't access, and chafing against the isolation that Hopper insisted was necessary for her safety, creating a father-daughter dynamic built on genuine care but strained by 11's growing desire for freedom and connection to the friend she had sacrificed everything to protect. Hopper's rules were strict and non-negotiable. 11 couldn't leave the cabin, couldn't use her powers where anyone might see, couldn't make contact with Mike or the others because any exposure risked drawing attention from the government agents who still sought her. These restrictions, necessary though they were, created a pressure that built steadily through the summer and into fall. 11's adolescent need for independence, clashing with Hopper's protective paranoia. Their arguments escalating until one particularly fierce fight led to 11 doing the forbidden, using her powers to discover the truth about her mother, yet finding Terry Ives' location among Hopper's hidden files, and making the decision to leave the cabin and seek answers about her origins, a journey that would reveal truths about her past and introduce her to powers she had barely begun to explore. 11's visit to Terry, facilitated by stealing Hopper's emergency cash and hitchhiking to the address in Pennsylvania, brought her face to face with the living ghost of her mother, the catatonic woman whose eyes held a flicker of recognition when 11 entered the room. Becky trying to explain that Terry was beyond reach, while 11, refusing to accept this, used her abilities to enter Terry's mind, experiencing her mother's looped memories firsthand, the experiments, the birth, the theft of the baby, the electroshock torture, and most crucially, the revelation that Terry had been pregnant. That 11 was indeed her daughter, stolen and raised as a weapon. This confirmation of her identity, the knowledge that she had come from love, even if that love had been brutally severed, transformed 11's understanding of herself, though it came with the devastating recognition that her mother could never truly return from the prison of her fractured mind. The journey to Terry opened another path as well, one that led 11 to Chicago and to Kaylee, also known as 8, another of Brenner's test subjects who had escaped years earlier and now led a group of outcasts in a quest for revenge against those who had wronged them. Kaylee, possessing the power to create illusions that made people see their worst fears or believe in phantom realities, recognized 11 immediately, remembering her as the younger girl in the Rainbow Room, and offered her a choice: join them in hunting down the laboratory personnel who had tortured them, or return to the quiet life of hiding that Hopper had imposed. For a brief, intoxicating time, 11 embraced the anger that Kaylee encouraged, using her powers to help track down a former lab worker, nearly killing him in a moment of fury before seeing his children and recognizing that revenge, however justified the rage might be, wasn't who she wanted to become. In a pivotal moment of character definition, 11 chose mercy over vengeance and decided to return to Hawkins, driven by a vision of her friends in danger and the understanding that her true family, the people she had chosen and who had chosen her, needed her more than her anger needed satisfaction. While 11 pursued her identity, Hawkins descended into crisis as the Mind Flayer's invasion progressed through multiple vectors, each designed to weaken the town's defenses and expand the Upside Down's foothold in reality. Will's connection to the hive mind intensified, his episodes becoming full possessions where the Mind Flayer looked through his eyes and spoke through his voice, until one Halloween night when Will encountered a particularly massive incursion of the Upside Down's influence, the dimension bleeding through so strongly that Will couldn't distinguish between realities. And the Mind Flayer seized full control, colonizing his body with a viral fury that left the boy a puppet, his consciousness buried beneath the entity's vast intelligence. The possession manifested physically through Will's plummeting body temperature, his aversion to heat, which threatened the Mind Flayer's comfortable cold, and his knowledge of things he couldn't possibly know. Tactical information about the tunnels spreading beneath Hawkins like a cancerous root system, extensions of the Upside Down burrowing through the earth in preparation for full dimensional merger. Hopper, investigating the rotting pumpkin patches that had expanded into dying forests, discovered the tunnel system when the ground collapsed beneath him, plunging him into a nightmare landscape of vines and tendrils, the walls pulsing with organic life, the air thick with spores that infected anyone who breathed them too deeply. The tunnels, revealed through Will's drawings when Joyce noticed he was compulsively sketching interconnected lines, formed a massive web beneath Hawkins, centered on the laboratory's gate and spreading outward toward the town's populated areas, a network that functioned as both fortress and organism, the Mind Flayer's beachhead for transforming Hawkins into a hybrid space where the Upside Down could exist openly. Owens, finally confronting the full scope of the incursion, initiated a plan to burn the tunnels, pumping them full of accelerant and igniting a firestorm that would cauterize the infection, though this aggressive response risked triggering the Mind Flayer's full retaliation. The crisis escalated when a group of baby Demogorgons, creatures that Dustin had initially mistaken for a strange pet he named Dart before recognizing it as a predatory monster from the Upside Down, matured in the tunnels and emerged in a coordinated assault on Hawkins' laboratory, their attack guided by the Mind Flayer's intelligence and timed to coincide with the tunnel burning. A strategic strike designed to eliminate the laboratory staff and secure the gate for full-scale dimensional merger. The Demodog Pack, as the boys termed them, slaughtered their way through the facility's security, bulletproof and terrifyingly fast, overwhelming the guards and scientists with predatory efficiency until only Owens and a handful of staff remained, trapped in the facility's lower levels with the gate pulsing behind them and the creatures systematically hunting through every room. Bob Newby, Joyce's boyfriend and a man whose gentle nature and enthusiasm for puzzles seemed ill-suited to heroism, emerged as the unlikely savior when the laboratory's lockdown trapped Joyce, Hopper, Will, and Mike inside with the Demodogs between them and escape. Bob, using his knowledge of computers from his job at Radio Shack, hacked into the laboratory's systems and manually reset the locks, guiding the group through his walkie-talkie instructions while remaining in the control room, a choice born from necessity, but which sealed his fate. As Joyce, Hopper, and the boys fled toward the exit, Bob completed his task and ran after them, almost reaching safety before a Demodog burst from a side corridor, tackling him in full view of Joyce, who screamed for him to run, even as more creatures descended, tearing Bob apart in seconds of savage violence that left Joyce shattered and traumatized, the kindest man she had known dying to save her son, a sacrifice that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The group's escape from the laboratory converged with multiple other resolutions. Steve Harrington, having become an unlikely protector of the boys after forming a bond with Dustin, fought Demodogs with his nail bat and a fierce determination to keep the kids safe. Nancy and Jonathan, having pursued their own investigation into the laboratory's crimes and formed a romantic connection built on shared trauma and loss, returned from exposing Hawkins Lab to government officials with promises of shutdown and containment. And Lucas's younger sister Erica, along with Max, the new girl whose stepbrother Billy carried his own darkness, joined the expanding group of those who knew Hawkins' terrible secret. At the Byers house, converted into a command center, Joyce made the desperate decision to attempt exorcising the Mind Flayer from Will through heat, cranking the temperature to unbearable levels while Will, or the entity controlling him, screamed and thrashed, revealing the location of the gate and insisting they couldn't close it, that it was too late. Before finally the heat forced enough of the Mind Flayer's presence out that Will's consciousness could resurface, battered but freed from direct control. In the tunnels beneath Hawkins, where Hopper and the boys had ventured to draw the Demodogs away from the gate closing effort, they found themselves surrounded by the creatures, death imminent. When 11, having returned to Hawkins with Hopper's stolen police car and found the chaos in full swing, arrived at the laboratory with Hopper at her side, facing the gate that pulsed with malevolent energy, its membrane thin and the vast shadow of the Mind Flayer visible beyond, a creature of such immense scale that only its limbs could be seen through the opening, each one larger than a building, suggesting a body that dwarfed comprehension. 11, recognizing that only she could seal the dimensional rift, approached the gate, extended her hands, and drew upon every reserve of power she possessed, screaming with effort as she forced the gate to close, the membrane knitting back together inch by agonizing inch, while Mike, watching from the tunnel through Hopper's radio link, encouraged her. His voice a lifeline that 11 clung to as she pushed beyond every limit Brenner had tested, blood pouring from her nose and eyes, the psychic effort manifesting as physical agony until finally, with a sound like reality healing, the gate sealed. The last glimpse of the Upside Down being the Mind Flayer's rage. A psychic scream of fury at being denied its conquest, a promise that this was merely a setback, not a defeat. The closing of the gate forced the Mind Flayer's presence out of Will entirely, the boy gasping as if surfacing from deep water, his ordeal leaving him weak but free. While in the tunnels, the Demodogs collapsed simultaneously, their connection to the hive mind severed, reduced to ordinary corpses that the government cleanup crews would later incinerate, erasing the evidence, along with the bodies of the laboratory staff who had perished in the assault. Hawkins, for the second time, returned to an enforced normalcy. The laboratory officially shut down due to safety violations, substantial compensation paid to affected families, along with new non-disclosure agreements. Dr. Owens using his position to secure a birth certificate for 11 under the name Jane Hopper, allowing her to officially exist and attend school. A paper trail that gave her a life while also marking her location in government records. A risk that Hopper and Owens judged worth taking for the normalcy it provided. The snowball dance at Hawkins Middle School in December provided a moment of peace and adolescent joy, the kids dressed up and awkward, navigating the foreign territory of slow dances and romantic feelings, 11 appearing in a dress and makeup that transformed her from the feral survivor into a girl stepping toward normal teenage life. Mike speechless and blushing as they danced to Every Breath You Take, Nancy dancing with Dustin to spare him embarrassment, Lucas and Max sharing moments that suggested their constant bickering masked deeper feelings, and Will smiling genuinely for perhaps the first time since his return, lost in the simple pleasure of being a kid at a dance. Yet even in this moment of happiness, the camera pulled back to reveal the Upside Down still existing in its frozen state, and the Mind Flayer, colossal and patient, looming over the dimension's reflection of Hawkins Middle School, watching the celebration through some unfathomable sense, already planning its next move, understanding now that Hawkins possessed defenders who could thwart direct assault, meaning future strategies would require subtlety, time, and vectors of attack that wouldn't be recognized until far too late to prevent. The summer of 1985 brought unprecedented heat to Hawkins, and changes that seemed, on surface examination, entirely mundane. Starcourt Mall opened, a gleaming temple to consumerism that quickly became the social center of town, drawing shoppers from the surrounding counties and providing summer jobs for many of Hawkins' teenagers, including Steve, who worked at Scoops Ahoy ice cream parlor in a sailor uniform that utterly destroyed any cool factor he'd once possessed, much to Dustin's delight. The mall's arrival killed downtown Hawkins's small businesses, stores that had served the community for generations, unable to compete with the variety and air conditioning that Starcourt offered, creating economic resentment that simmered beneath the town's enthusiasm for the new attraction. Yet beneath the mall's bright lights and cheerful consumerism, something far more sinister had taken root. A conspiracy that connected to Russia, the Upside Down, and the Cold War paranoia that had originally birthed Hawkins Laboratory decades earlier. The Soviet Union, having learned of the Hawkins Gate through espionage and recognizing the potential military applications of accessing another dimension, had spent years developing the technology to create their own gate, attempting to tear through to the Upside Down from facilities in Kamchatka with limited success. Their dimensional drills managing only brief, unstable riftures before the barriers snapped shut, resisting their intrusions. Soviet scientists theorized that Hawkins represented a weak point, a location where the barriers had been so thoroughly compromised that another gate could be forced open more easily. And this theory led to a bold plan: infiltrate the United States, establish a secret base beneath American soil, and use clandestine technology to reopen the gate that 11 had sealed, all while disguising the operation as a simple mall construction project. Starcourt Mall, then, was a facade. Its true purpose, concealing the massive elevator that descended 300 feet to a secret installation where dozens of Russian scientists and soldiers worked to power a laser device of staggering energy output, a machine designed to burn through the dimensional barriers and establish Soviet access to the Upside Down, giving them a weapons advantage that would shift the balance of the Cold War irrevocably. The conspiracy might have succeeded undetected if not for the curiosity of the kids and a series of coincidences that exposed the edges of the operation. Dustin, returning from science camp with his new girlfriend Susie from Utah, whom no one quite believed existed, brought back a high-tech radio he'd built, and while testing it late one night, intercepted a Russian transmission, a coded message broadcasting from somewhere within Hawkins, its repetitive pattern suggesting active communications rather than a relic from old Cold War monitoring. Dustin, recognizing that Russians operating in Hawkins couldn't mean anything good, recruited Steve to help translate the message, a task that proved beyond them until Robin, or Steve's co-worker at Scoops Ahoy, who spoke multiple languages and possessed a genius-level intellect hidden beneath her band geek exterior, decoded the message as a delivery schedule listing various locations within Starcourt Mall, confirming that Soviet operatives were actively using the mall as a base of operations. What followed was an investigation that combined the kids' determination with escalating danger. Steve, Robin, Dustin, and eventually Lucas's younger sister Erica, the only person small enough to fit through the air ducts, infiltrated the secret elevator, descending into the base where they discovered not just a few spies, but an entire military installation, complete with guards, scientists, and the massive laser device that was, at that very moment, burning through the dimensional barriers deep beneath the mall, its energy signature beginning to destabilize the gate that 11 had sealed. The group's discovery came at a cost, Steve and Robin captured by Russian security and subjected to brutal interrogation, including truth serum injections that left them drugged and vulnerable, their escape dependent on Dustin and Erica creating a distraction, and 11, Mike, Max, Lucas, and Will arriving after their own investigation into strange electromagnetic disturbances revealed the Russian operation's scope. The electromagnetic interference from the laser had consequences beyond the intended gate reopening, effects that manifested in disturbing ways throughout Hawkins. Rats behaving erratically, gathering in massive groups and moving with coordinated purpose toward the steel mill on the outskirts of town. Townspeople, including Billy Hargrove, Max's abusive stepbrother, and Hawkins Post journalist Nancy's boss, exhibiting personality changes and bizarre behaviors after encounters with locations marked by dimensional bleeding. And most horrifying, the discovery that the Mind Flayer, unable to maintain presence in our world after the gate's closure, had left behind a fragment of itself, a piece that had survived in the Upside Down's atmosphere trapped in Hawkins's tunnels and now, sensing the gate weakening, was reconstituting itself by possessing hosts and melding them into a grotesque collective, a flesh monster built from dissolved humans, animated by the Mind Flayer's consciousness and growing larger with each person it consumed. Billy Hargrove's possession represented the Mind Flayer's most insidious adaptation, the entity having learned from its failure with Will that a single host could be exorcised if the human consciousness fought back. So this iteration operated differently, selecting Billy at a moment of vulnerability. The young man's abusive childhood and self-hatred creating cracks that the Mind Flayer exploited, promising power and purpose while steadily eroding Billy's sense of self until he became a willing instrument, flayed by the entity's control while retaining enough intelligence to operate independently, recruiting others to the cause by leading them to the Mind Flayer's physical form at the steel mill, where tentacles invaded their bodies and dissolved them into the collective. The flayed walked through Hawkins in a horrifying pantomime of normalcy, performing their jobs and maintaining family routines while secretly serving the Mind Flayer, their true nature revealed only when they liquefied, flesh and bone, melting into organic sludge that flowed through pipes and sewers to join the growing mass at the mill. A body the Mind Flayer was constructing that would serve as its avatar in the physical world, a creature of such size and power that conventional weapons would be useless against it. Nancy and Jonathan, investigating strange behavior at the hospital where Mrs. Driscoll, one of the flayed, had been admitted for eating fertilizer, discovered the conspiracy's depth when the patients they'd been monitoring liquefied and escaped, flowing through the hospital's plumbing while security guards, also flayed, attempted to kill Nancy and Jonathan to preserve the secret. Their investigation, combined with Eleven's psychic reconnaissance, where she remote viewed the Mind Flayer's construction process and witnessed the horror of people being dissolved and consumed, revealed the timeline. The Russians would reopen the gate within days. The Mind Flayer's avatar would reach full size simultaneously, and the combined assault of dimensional incursion and massive monster would overwhelm any defense Hawkins could mount, meaning both threats needed to be addressed simultaneously, splitting the group's already limited resources across multiple battlegrounds. Hopper and Joyce, having been brought into the crisis through their own investigation of the magnetic disturbances affecting Hopper's property and Joyce's concern over the electromagnetic fields causing strange phenomena, joined forces with Murray Bauman, the conspiracy theorist who had helped Nancy expose Hawkins Lab and whose paranoid expertise in Soviet operations proved invaluable in understanding the Russian installation's layout and security. This unlikely team, supplemented by Alexei, a captured Russian scientist who defected after realizing his government's plan would doom both nations if the Mind Flayer gained full access to Earth, infiltrated the base with the goal of destroying the laser before the gate fully reopened, a mission that required reaching the control room through a facility filled with armed soldiers who had orders to shoot intruders on sight. The 4th of July, Hawkins's annual celebration of independence, became the deadline for all converging threats. The Russians scheduled their final gate-opening attempt for the holiday. Counting on the fireworks and festivities to mask any unusual activity, the Mind Flayer planned to complete its avatar that same night, Billy herding a final batch of hosts to the steel mill for consumption, and Eleven, who had been relying on her powers to track and fight the flayed, discovered with growing horror that her abilities were fading, the Mind Flayer's avatar having wounded her with a piece of itself that burrowed into her leg, an organic tracking device that also seemed to poison her connection to her powers, leaving her increasingly vulnerable just as the crisis reached its apex. At Starcourt Mall, transformed into a battleground when the various groups converged, the kids, Steve, Robin, Erica, and Nancy, attempted to evacuate civilians while drawing the Mind Flayer's avatar away from populated areas. The creature smashing through the mall's facade with terrifying purpose, its mass of flayed flesh and teeth singularly focused on killing Eleven, whom the Mind Flayer recognized as the greatest threat to its existence. Billy, still retaining enough consciousness to struggle against the Mind Flayer's control, received orders to capture Eleven and hold her for the Avatar's consumption, leading to a confrontation in the mall's corridors where Billy hunted the girl while his victims, reduced to the flayed collective, formed walls of flesh to cut off escape routes. The mall's bright commercial spaces rendered hellish by the organic horror spreading through them like infection. Simultaneously, beneath them all in the Russian base, Hopper, Joyce, and Murray fought their way toward the control room. Encountering resistance that escalated from security guards to elite soldiers, Hopper's brawling style and Joyce's desperate determination carrying them forward, even as injuries mounted and ammunition dwindled. Alexei, the scientist who had risked everything to help them, fell to a Russian Terminator, a specialized assassin sent to eliminate the defectors, his death coming just moments after he'd experienced his first American 4th of July celebration, the tragedy of a man killed for choosing conscience over country marking. Hopper with guilt that would haunt his final moments. Reaching the control room, Joyce faced the terrible choice of operating the machine that would destroy the laser and close the gate, knowing that Hopper was still in the room below. Fighting the Terminator in a brutal hand-to-hand combat that would end with only one survivor, and that activating the failsafe would trap him in the exploding facility with no time to escape. In the mall above, as the Mind Flayer's avatar cornered Eleven and prepared to consume her, Billy, ordered to hold her in place, grabbed Eleven's arms and seemed ready to deliver her to the creature's tentacles when Eleven, recognizing a flicker of the human beneath the possession, spoke to the remnant of Billy, reminding him of his mother. The one person who had shown him love before his father's abuse had twisted him into the angry young man he'd become. This appeal to buried humanity created a moment of resistance, Billy's consciousness surging against the Mind Flayer's control, his hands releasing Eleven and instead spreading wide to shield her, taking the avatar's impaling tentacles through his own body, buying precious seconds as the creature repeatedly stabbed him, Billy's sacrifice allowing the others to wound the avatar with fireworks, the heat and noise disorienting the collective intelligence. While beneath them all, Joyce activated the failsafe, her tears falling as she turned the keys and watched Hopper, standing on the platform below, give her a nod of acceptance before the laser exploded, the machine's destruction sending a shockwave through the gate that slammed it shut once more, severing the Mind Flayer's avatar from its dimension's power. The avatar, cut off from the upside-down sustaining energy, collapsed into inert flesh, the flayed consciousness dissolving as the hive-mind connection broke, leaving only the biological matter behind while Billy, freed from possession in his final moments, looked at Max and managed, "I'm sorry," before dying in her arms. His redemption purchased at the cost of his life. A complex legacy of abuse, possession, and ultimate sacrifice that left Max devastated and guilt-ridden, wondering if she could have saved him or if she'd been right to hate him for the cruelty he'd inflicted on her throughout their sibling relationship. Hopper's fate remained ambiguous in the immediate aftermath, Joyce and the others finding only an empty platform where he'd stood, the explosion's energy having consumed or obliterated anything in its radius, leading to the official conclusion that Hawkins police chief had died in the catastrophic mall fire that served as the cover story for the battle, though Joyce, Murray, and those who knew the truth harbored desperate hopes that Hopper might somehow have survived, a hope that seemed delusional given the complete absence of any evidence. The summer's end brought profound changes. 11, her powers still absent despite the Mind Flayer's defeat, moved with the Byers family to California. Joyce unable to remain in Hawkins after losing both Bob and Hopper, needing a fresh start away from the town's accumulated trauma. Mike and Eleven's relationship forced into long distance, strained under the weight of separation and Mike's inability to articulate his feelings in letters. Steve and Robin, bonded by their shared torture and drugging, became inseparable friends, Robin having come out to Steve during their truth serum-addled imprisonment, creating a dynamic of platonic love and mutual support. And Nancy and Jonathan, both accepted to college but facing their own separation, as Nancy prepared for Emerson while Jonathan stayed close to support his family, felt their relationship beginning to crack under the pressure of diverging futures and unspoken resentments. The closure of the Russian operation sent international shockwaves, the U.S. government quietly negotiating with Soviet officials to ensure mutual silence about the dimensional research, both nations recognizing that public knowledge of the Upside Down would create mass panic and potentially inspire other countries to seek their own access to the dimension. turning the Cold War into an even more dangerous competition for supernatural weapons. Yet in Kamchatka, in a prison labor camp far from Moscow's oversight, Soviet officials had maintained a contingency. Having kept a Demogorgon captured from their brief, successful gate openings and keeping it stored in a reinforced cell, fed with prisoners who were told they were being sent to freedom but instead were thrown into the creature's pen, their screams echoing across the frozen landscape as the USSR prepared for future attempts to access the dimension that had claimed so many of their operatives in Hawkins. In this distant camp, among the prisoners forced to labor in brutal conditions with the constant threat of the Demogorgon's feeding adding to the atmosphere of terror, an American worked under an assumed name. His head shaved and face marked by beatings, his identity concealed from the other prisoners, but revealed to the audience in the final moments of the Summers Chronicle, Hopper. Having somehow survived the explosion through means not immediately explained, captured by the Russians who had escaped the Hawkins base before its destruction. Held as a prisoner who knew too much to be released, and who represented potential leverage against the United States in future negotiations, his existence a secret from everyone who mourned him, his survival a small mercy in a situation that offered little hope of escape or rescue, a cliffhanger that promised his suffering was far from over, and that the connections between Hawkins and Russia's dimensional research remained dangerously active despite the apparent victory. The quiet months between the summer of 1985 and the spring of 1986 passed with Hawkins attempting once more to return to normalcy. The town's population declining slightly as families who could afford to move chose to relocate, unable to shake the feeling that Hawkins was cursed despite the official explanations for the mall fire and previous incidents. Those who remained developed a practiced ignorance, a willful determination not to ask too many questions about the strange events that kept plaguing their community, creating an atmosphere where cognitive dissonance became the norm, and neighbors agreed implicitly never to discuss the obvious patterns of tragedy and impossibility. In California, the Byers family struggled to adjust. Joyce working long hours at a low-paying job, Jonathan juggling school and family responsibilities while his relationship with Nancy deteriorated over crackling long-distance phone calls full of silences and half-truths, and Will attempting to find his place in a new school, facing bullies who mocked his sensitive nature, and Hawkins' refugee status while also grappling with feelings he couldn't articulate, an awareness of his sexuality that was only beginning to surface amid the challenges of adolescence and ongoing trauma from his possessions. 11, attending high school as Jane Hopper and attempting to navigate social hierarchies without her powers to fall back on, faced her own crises of identity. Mockery from popular girls who sensed her differences and exploited them. Confusion about her relationship with Mike, whose letters had become infrequent and impersonal. And a growing friendship with Will built on their shared experiences as outsiders and survivors of the Upside Down's particular attentions. Her powers, dormant since the mall battle, refused to return despite her desperate attempts to summon them, leaving her feeling helpless and ordinary in ways that she'd never experienced. The abilities that had defined her entire existence simply gone, as if the well she'd always drawn from had permanently run dry. This loss of powers, combined with the normal struggles of teenage girlhood, left 11 vulnerable in ways that would prove dangerous when the Upside Down's influence reached across the country to target her specifically. In Hawkins, Mike descended into a depression that he hid behind Dungeons & Dragons campaigns and a surface-level friendship with the Hellfire Club, the school's D&D group led by Eddie Munson, a senior who'd been held back twice and whose enthusiastic embrace of outcast status and love of heavy metal made him a social pariah, but a magnetic presence for those who didn't fit the jock or popular crowd molds. Mike's participation in Hellfire represented both genuine interest in the game and a way to fill the void left by Eleven's absence and Will's departure. Though his friends Dustin and Lucas noticed his emotional withdrawal, the way Mike went through motions without the spark that had once made him the party's heart. Lucas, meanwhile, faced his own identity crisis, having made the basketball team and dating Max, torn between his jock new social status and his loyalty to the Hellfire Club, ultimately choosing to play in the championship game rather than attend the final D&D session. a decision that would create tensions within the friend group at precisely the moment they needed to be united. Max, grieving Billy's death and consumed by guilt over her relief at his demise mixed with sorrow for the lost possibility of a real sibling relationship, isolated herself from her friends, ending her relationship with Lucas, and spending her days listening to Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill on her Walkman, using the music to create a bubble that kept the world at arm's length. Her mother, unable to cope with Billy's death and her own guilt over the relationship with Neil that had brought them to Hawkins, descended into alcoholism and prescription drug abuse, leaving Max to essentially raise herself in a trailer park where poverty and dysfunction were the norm. Her scholarship application essays full of the kind of trauma that guidance counselors didn't know how to address. Max's isolation and depression, her wish that terrible things would happen to those who had hurt her, and her survivor's guilt over being alive when Billy and Barb and others weren't, created a psychological signature that the Mind Flayer, patient and intelligent, recognized as an opportunity for revenge and reconquest. The Mind Flayer, trapped in the Upside Down since the gate's closure but still conscious and planning, had spent the intervening months studying the patterns of previous failures, understanding that brute force and obvious possession could be countered by Hawkins' defenders, but that something subtler, an attack that exploited human psychology and targeted the group's emotional bonds, might succeed where previous attempts had failed. Unable to maintain a physical presence in Hawkins without an open gate, the Mind Flayer instead worked through Vecna, the entity's true name and original identity finally revealed as Henry Creel, once known as One, the first child with powers whom Brenner had encountered and whose existence predated the entire MK Ultra program at Hawkins Lab. Henry's story, buried for decades and unknown to Eleven despite their time together in the laboratory, represented the original sin from which all of Hawkins' horrors descended, a tale of psychic power twisted by darkness long before Brenner's experiments began. In 1959, the Creel family moved into a beautiful Victorian house in Hawkins, Victor Creel bringing his wife Virginia and children Henry and Alice to what should have been an idyllic small-town life, the family seeking a fresh start after Victor's difficult return from World War II, his service having left him with trauma that manifested in nightmares and occasional violent outbursts. The house, however, harbored something wrong, an oppressive atmosphere that Virginia attributed to supernatural presence, reporting phenomena that escalated from flickering lights and cold spots to visions of her husband transforming into a demon, attacks she believed were the house trying to drive them away or punish them for some unknown transgression. In reality, Henry Creel, the family's young son, possessed psychic abilities of staggering power, and more troublingly, a complete absence of empathy. A void where human connection should exist, his powers having granted him insight into others' minds, which revealed to him what he interpreted as the falseness of human relationships, the performance of civilization laid over animal nature, leading him to conclude that humanity's pretense should be stripped away to reveal the truth beneath. Henry's powers allowed him to perceive time differently, to see past and potential futures overlapping, to understand reality as a construct that psychic force could reshape. And this perception convinced him that the traditional boundaries of morality were simply limitations that the powerful could transcend. Studying spiders, creatures that he admired for their honest predation and lack of pretense, Henry began experimenting with his abilities on his family, creating the haunting phenomena that Virginia experienced, torturing his mother psychologically before escalating to physical attacks, twisting Alice's body with telekinetic force until bones snapped and organs ruptured, leaving his sister dead in a manner that appeared to be supernatural violence. Victor, discovering the carnage and having no framework to understand what had occurred, was blamed for the murders, his war trauma, and occasional episodes of lost time, making him the perfect suspect in a narrative that Hawkins police and courts eagerly embraced, sentencing him to a psychiatric institution where he would spend decades insisting that a demon had killed his family, his true story dismissed as the delusions of a broken mind. Henry, having successfully framed his father and murdered most of his family, fell into a coma after the killings, the exertion of his powers beyond what his young body could sustain, and while comatose was identified by Dr. Brenner, who had been following reports of unexplained phenomena and recognized the Creel murders as evidence of psychic ability. Brenner, seeing in Henry the proof of concept for everything he hoped to achieve, took custody of the boy, installed him in Hawkins' laboratory as Subject 1, and began the experiments that would eventually lead to the MK-Ultra program's expansion and the creation of other numbered children, including 11. Henry, waking in the laboratory, recognized Brenner's interest as both opportunity and prison, understanding that he could never truly be free while the doctor lived, but also that Brenner's resources might help him expand his powers beyond their current limitations, leading to a complex relationship where Henry served as assistant and test subject simultaneously, biding his time while growing stronger. By the 1970s, when 11 and the other children were young subjects in the Rainbow Room, one had become an integral part of the laboratory's structure, wearing an inhibitor device that Brenner installed to suppress his powers ostensibly for everyone's safety, but actually because Brenner feared what Henry might do with unrestrained access to his abilities. One befriended 11, recognizing her potential as either ally or threat, teaching her to harness her anger and pain to fuel her telekinesis, encouraging her to see Brenner as the true monster in their lives, grooming her to eventually free him from the inhibitor so they could escape together and reshape the world according to his vision of honest, predatory hierarchy rather than the lies of human civilization. When 11, trusting one as her only friend, removed his inhibitor in a moment of rebellion against Brenner's cruel treatment, Henry's powers erupted with apocalyptic force, massacring every other child in the laboratory, their bodies twisted and broken in the Rainbow Room in seconds of telekinetic fury, blood painting the walls in a massacre that Brenner barely escaped by sealing himself in a secure room. One turned to 11, expecting her to join him in his freedom, offering her a place in his new order where they would rule as gods among insects. But 11, confronting the reality of his nature and the corpses of the other children who had been her siblings in suffering, refused, declaring no with a force that came from genuine moral clarity rather than Brenner's conditioning. The battle that followed exceeded anything 11 had demonstrated before, her protective fury matching one's nihilistic rage. The two psychic powerhouses locked in combat that shattered the laboratory's walls and warped reality itself around them until 11, drawing on reserves she didn't know existed, pushed one through the wall into the dimension beyond. A one-way psychic expulsion that tore Henry from our reality and cast him into the Upside Down, which at that moment might have been merely a dark reflection without malevolent intelligence, but which Henry's arrival would transform into something far worse. Henry Creel's arrival in the Upside Down, injured from 11's assault and trapped in the dimension's hostile environment, should have killed him, but instead catalyzed a transformation that merged his consciousness with the dimension itself. The fall from the laboratory shattered his body, leaving him barely alive and exposed to the Upside Down's atmosphere, its particles and tendrils invading his wounds and fusing with his flesh in a grotesque bonding that preserved his life while fundamentally altering his existence. Over time, measured in years from Hawkins's perspective, but perhaps experienced differently in the Upside Down's strange temporal properties, Henry became something other than human, his body maintained in an undead state by the dimension's energy, his flesh desiccated and covered in vines that fed him the Upside Down's sustaining force, his mind expanding to encompass the dimension's vast geography and limited consciousness, until he didn't merely exist in the Upside Down but had become its ruling intelligence. The Mind Flayer, not a separate entity, but rather Henry's consciousness expressed through the dimension itself, his spider fixation manifested in the massive arachnid form that loomed over the landscape. As Vecna, the name he adopted from 11's friend Mike's Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, Henry understood that 11 had grown more powerful since their confrontation, that direct assault would likely fail again, and that the gate needed to reopen permanently rather than through temporary rifts if he was to achieve his vision of merging dimensions and destroying the false constructs of human civilization. His plan developed over years of patient observation through the cracks between dimensions, exploited the trauma he had perceived in Hawkins' teenagers, specifically targeting those suffering from guilt, depression, and isolation. 4 victims whose deaths in specific locations would create gates at the murder sites. 4 gates that would combine to tear reality open permanently, allowing Vecna to cross over fully and transform Hawkins into a hybrid space where the Upside Down's truth would overwhelm humanity's lies. Chrissy Cunningham, Hawkins High's head cheerleader and the perfect embodiment of popularity on the surface, became Vecna's first target in March 1986. Her hidden struggles with her mother's emotional abuse and eating disorder creating the psychological signature that Vecna's curse exploited. The curse manifested initially as visions, Chrissy seeing her mother in mirrors speaking cruelties, clocks appearing in impossible locations as temporal markers counting down to her death. The visions escalating until Chrissy, desperate for relief from the psychological torture, sought out Eddie Munson to buy drugs, hoping that getting high might silence the terrors that were destroying her sleep and sanity. At Eddie's trailer, as Chrissy waited for him to retrieve the drugs, Vecna struck fully, pulling her consciousness into his domain within the Upside Down, a space that manifested her worst fears and memories while her physical body, still in the trailer, rose into the air. In the living room where Eddie returned to witness her levitation and the horrifying aftermath as her bones broke, limbs twisting into impossible angles, eyes collapsing into her skull, jaw dislocated, every injury a psychic assault translated into physical trauma before her corpse dropped to the floor, leaving Eddie traumatized and running, knowing that no one would believe the truth and that he, the town freak, would be blamed for a murder he couldn't explain. Chrissy's death, officially unexplained but popularly attributed to Eddie despite the lack of evidence linking him to the physical injuries, sent Hawkins into a panic that was amplified when days later another student died in identical fashion and then a third victim was taken, this time surviving long enough in Vecna's realm to describe through Max's Walkman intervention what she experienced. A monster, in the shape of a man but wrong, vines growing through his flesh, his voice echoing from multiple directions, his hand reaching out to consume her memories and life force before the music she loved, the emotional anchor of Kate Bush's lyrics, pulled her back to reality before Vecna could complete the kill. These visions, combined with Max's research into Victor Creel's story and a daring infiltration of the psychiatric hospital where Victor remained institutionalized, revealed patterns that connected the 1959 murders to the current deaths, suggesting that whatever had killed the Creel family had returned or perhaps never left, and that music, specifically songs with strong emotional resonance for the victim, could serve as a lifeline back from Vecna's realm. The positive memories associated with the music creating a beacon that broke the curse's hold temporarily. The revelation that Eddie was innocent came too late to prevent a manhunt led by Jason Carver, whose girlfriend Chrissy's death had radicalized him into believing that Hellfire Club was a satanic cult. Eddie's love of D&D and metal music cited as evidence of demonic influence, the town's evangelical contingent eagerly embracing this narrative as explanation for the unexplainable deaths, creating a mob mentality that threatened to lynch Eddie if he was found before police could intervene. Eddie, hiding with help from Dustin and the others who believed his account of Chrissy's supernatural death, provided crucial details about her symptoms before the attack. Headaches, nightmares, seeing things that weren't there. A profile that Max realized she matched perfectly, her depression and guilt over Billy making her Vecna's ideal target. Confirmed when she began experiencing her own symptoms, the curse having marked her as the 4th and final victim, whose death would complete the ritual. 11, in California and still powerless, received a desperate message from Mike explaining the crisis, leading her to seek help from Dr. Owens, who arrived with a proposal. Undergo an experimental procedure to restore her abilities by reliving the trauma of the laboratory massacre, diving back into her repressed memories to access the source of her powers. A process that required her voluntary commitment to a sensory deprivation tank in a secret facility and days of psychological torture as she confronted the truth of one's identity and her role in banishing him to the Upside Down. This revelation, that Henry Creel was Vecna was the Mind Flayer, recontextualized everything. Eleven understood about the threats Hawkins had faced, showing that every incursion, every possession, every death traced back to her decision to free one from his inhibitor, a guilt that Brenner, who had survived and resurfaced to oversee Eleven's power restoration, cruelly exploited to motivate her cooperation with his procedures. Simultaneously in Russia, Joyce and Murray, having received evidence from Owens that Hopper survived and was being held in Kamchatka, mounted a rescue operation that required them to bribe guards, infiltrate the prison camp, and ultimately face the Demogorgon that the Soviets kept as both weapon and executioner. Hopper, reduced by months of brutal labor and torture to a shadow of his former self, initially refused to believe that rescue was possible, that Joyce had crossed the world to save him, his sense of self-worth destroyed by captivity, and the belief that Hawkins and Eleven were better off thinking him dead. The escape, achieved through a combination of Murray's unexpected combat skills, Joyce's determination that bordered on reckless, and Hopper's survival instincts finally overcoming his resignation, involved deliberately releasing the Demogorgon to create chaos in the camp, turning the creature against its captors in a gambit that nearly killed all three of them before they managed to reach a stolen helicopter and flee across the frozen landscape, Soviet forces in pursuit, but ultimately unable to prevent their escape to a safe house where Owens's contacts provided extraction back to the United States. In Hawkins, the combined group of Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Erica, Steve, Robin, Nancy, and the now embraced Eddie prepared for a final assault on Vecna, having determined through investigation and Nancy's own psychic encounter with Vecna, where he pulled her into his realm to deliver monologues about his philosophy and plans, that the killer existed physically in the Upside Down's version of the Creel house, his body maintained in a comatose state while his consciousness ranged freely to claim victims. The plan required multiple simultaneous actions. Max would serve as bait, allowing Vecna to begin claiming her while positioned in the Creel house, where others could locate and destroy his physical form. A team would enter the Upside Down through the still existing gate to the tunnel system and travel to Creel house. And distractions would prevent the Upside Down's creatures from interfering, specifically by drawing the Demobats, flying creatures that served as Vecna's guards, away from the house through music and chaos, the group's divisions reflecting their different strengths and the terrible necessity of splitting up to cover all fronts. The assault, launched on a timeline dictated by Max's degrading mental state as Vecna's curse advanced, saw Eddie and Dustin performing possibly the bravest act of the entire campaign by remaining in the Upside Down to draw the Demobat swarm with Eddie's electric guitar performance of Metallica's Master of Puppets, the heavy metal anthem blasting through the toxic atmosphere and indeed drawing thousands of the creatures away from Vecna's location, while Steve, Nancy, and Robin infiltrated the Creel house to find Vecna's body exactly where predicted, cocooned in vines and pulsing with the dimension's energy. They set him ablaze and shot him multiple times, the physical damage translating to psychic disruption that broke his hold on Max at the critical moment, allowing Lucas to pull her back from the brink with desperate pleas that she live, that she matter to him and the others, that dying would be abandoning rather than sparing them the burden she imagined herself to be. Yet even this coordinated assault, executed with the precision of a D&D campaign's final boss battle, couldn't fully stop Vecna, his power too deeply entwined with the Upside Down's essence for mere physical destruction to end him. As Vecna's burning body collapsed from the Creel house's window in the Upside Down, seemingly defeated, Max's momentary triumph turned to horror as Vecna struck one final time, his consciousness reasserting control for precious seconds, long enough to break Max's limbs, collapse her eyes, and stop her heart, completing the fourth kill that his ritual required even as Lucas screamed and performed CPR in a desperate attempt to keep her alive. The gates opened as planned, 4 rifts tearing through Hawkins at the murder sites, cracks in reality, that spread like fault lines through the town, combining into a massive interdimensional wound that split downtown Hawkins in half, buildings collapsing into the rift as the Upside Down's atmosphere began bleeding through, ash falling like snow over panicked residents who finally couldn't deny that something fundamentally wrong was occurring in their community. 11, her powers restored through the forced memory processing and now operating at levels that exceeded even her previous demonstrations, remote projected her consciousness from the Nevada facility where she remained confined, crossing the country psychically to enter Max's dying mind, finding her friend's consciousness retreating into death's darkness. In an act that violated every rule of natural order, 11 reached into that void and pulled Max back, restarting her heart through sheer psychic force, refusing to let another person she loved be taken by Vecna's malice, the effort leaving both girls drained and Max in a coma. Alive but with unknown prognosis, her mind present but dormant, locked in a space that even 11 couldn't fully access. This partial save represented a hollower victory than the group had hoped for. Max's life preserved, but her consciousness seemingly trapped, her future uncertain in ways that felt cruelly ambiguous after everything they had sacrificed. Eddie Munson's fate proved far more definitive and tragic. The young man who had spent the campaign running and hiding finally finding his moment of heroism by staying in the Upside Down to continue drawing the Demobats even after the plan called for retreat. Deliberately cutting the rope between dimensions to prevent Dustin from staying with him. Facing the swarm alone with his makeshift shield and spear, his last stand buying crucial minutes for the assault on Vecna but costing him his life. The bats overwhelming his defenses and tearing into his flesh until Dustin, having found another way back through, arrived to hold Eddie as he died. Eddie's final words being, "I didn't run away this time, right?" Seeking validation that his death had meaning, that the coward he'd believed himself to be had finally done something brave. Dustin's tears and assurances unable to prevent Eddie from bleeding out in the toxic atmosphere of the dimension he'd helped them fight. The aftermath saw Hawkins transformed into a disaster zone. The government's cover story of an earthquake failing to explain the gates or the ash or the phenomena that residents could see with their own eyes, leading to mass evacuation as those who could leave fled the town they no longer recognized. A fault line split Hawkins down the middle, gates pulsing with red energy connecting our dimension to the Upside Down. The barriers between worlds fundamentally compromised in ways that no amount of 11's power seemed able to seal. The damage too extensive and Vecna's consciousness too deeply embedded in the infrastructure of reality around Hawkins for simple closure. The Upside Down's influence spread visibly, plants dying in expanding circles around the gates, the air taking on a sulfurous quality, and in the distance, visible through the largest rift, the shape of Vecna's dimension, its red lightning and floating particles a constant reminder that the war was far from over. Hopper's return from Russia, reuniting with 11 in an embrace that both had believed impossible, provided one bright spot in the darkness. Joyce and Hopper's relationship finally acknowledged after years of circling each other, their shared trauma having forged bonds that both recognized as too valuable to deny any longer. Yet even this reunion was tempered by the reality of Hawkins' situation, the town they'd protected now fundamentally compromised, the gates remaining open and Vecna's ultimate fate unknown, his body having disappeared from where it fell in the Upside Down, suggesting that like the Mind Flayer and every other manifestation of the dimension's malice, he remained a persistent threat, merely regrouping rather than defeated. His plans delayed, but not abandoned. The survivors gathered at the abandoned Creel house in the real Hawkins, now the center of the dimensional instability, staring at the gates and understanding that everything they'd fought for had achieved, at best, a temporary stalemate. Will, whose connection to the Upside Down remained despite the Mind Flayer's apparent destruction, felt the dimension's presence intensifying, its influence spreading, and delivered the ominous assessment that Vecna was still alive, still planning, and that the gates represented not a crisis to be managed, but the beginning of an invasion that would eventually consume Hawkins entirely if they couldn't find a way to stop it. The group's exhaustion, both physical and emotional, warred with their understanding that rest wasn't an option, that the fight would continue whether they were ready or not, that Hawkins's fate and possibly the world's hung on their ability to find answers that had eluded them throughout years of desperate battles against forces that kept evolving new strategies to overwhelm their defenses. As ash fell like snow over Hawkins and the gates pulsed with rhythmic menace, the camera pulled back to show the town in its wounded state, refugees streaming out, while the core group remained, knowing that abandoning Hawkins meant allowing the Upside Down to establish a permanent foothold that would eventually spread beyond the town's boundaries, that their home had become ground zero for an invasion that only they, with their accumulated knowledge and Eleven's restored powers, had any hope of countering. The final images showed the Upside Down's landscape visible through the gates, the dimension no longer a distant threat but an immediate presence, its vines creeping through the cracks in reality, its spores drifting through Hawkins' air, and somewhere in that twisted mirror world, Vecna's consciousness stirring, his body reforming, his plans adapting to account for the resistance he'd encountered, his patience infinite, and his hatred for Eleven and all she represented burning with an intensity that promised the final confrontation was yet to come. The story, then, stands at a precipice, the timeline having traced from covert government experiments in the 1950s through decades of escalating supernatural horror to this moment where dimensions collide and the barriers between possible and impossible have been irreparably shattered. Every choice from Terry Ives' decision to volunteer for Brenner's studies, to Eleven's act of banishing one to Will's abduction into the Upside Down, to the group's repeated stands against overwhelming darkness, has led to this point where Hawkins exists as a hybrid space, neither fully real nor fully upside down, a town in transformation with its final form dependent on whether its defenders can find a way to seal the gates permanently, destroy Vecna conclusively, and restore the dimensional barriers that have protected humanity from the truth that monsters aren't legends, but rather neighbors separated by permeable boundaries that psychic power can breach. Looking ahead from this vantage in October 2025, with the fifth season's events still unfolding in production and the full resolution remaining mysteries to be revealed, the timeline invites contemplation of recurring themes that have defined Stranger Things' journey from small-town mystery to interdimensional war. The power of friendship as both strength and vulnerability. The bonds between the kids providing their greatest weapon against isolation and despair, while also creating points of leverage that entities like Vecna exploit. The cost of knowledge, with characters from Brenner to Hopper to Eleven. Learning that understanding comes with responsibilities and guilts that can't be unlearned. The question of whether power corrupts inevitably, Eleven's abilities having saved countless lives, but also marked her as Vecna's primary target and the unknowing architect of his freedom. And the persistence of trauma, every character carrying wounds that accumulate rather than heal, creating psychological landscapes as scarred as Hawkins' physical terrain. The symmetry between Eleven and Henry I Vecna frames the entire saga as a conflict between two philosophies applied to psychic power. Eleven's halting, difficult journey toward connection, empathy, and protection of others despite the world's cruelties, versus Henry's embrace of isolation, predation, and the stripping away of human connection as false construct obscuring nature's truth. Their final confrontation, whenever it comes, will represent not just a battle of abilities, but a test of which worldview proves more resilient. Whether the bonds that Eleven has formed can provide strength exceeding Henry's singular, undiluted will, or whether his philosophy that connection is weakness will be validated by her defeat. A question that resonates beyond the supernatural elements to touch on fundamental human anxieties about meaning, purpose, and whether caring for others represents humanity's greatest strength or fatal flaw. As we drift toward the conclusion of this comprehensive timeline, the gentle observation that emerges is how Stranger Things has consistently excavated the darkness beneath nostalgic 1980s Americana, using the aesthetic of Spielbergian adventure and John Carpenter horror to explore genuinely disturbing questions about government accountability, the commodification of children for military purposes, the way trauma compounds across generations, and the fragility of the barriers we assume protect us from chaos. Hawkins, with its Norman Rockwell surface concealing laboratories and dimensional gates, becomes a metaphor for American innocence revealed as constructed mythology. The comfortable lies of small-town safety stripped away to expose the exploitation and violence that such myths conceal, forcing characters and audience alike to confront complexity that resists easy resolution or comfortable nostalgia. In the quiet of this moment, with the story's final chapter still unwritten and the characters' fates hanging in uncertainty, we can reflect on how the journey from that first night when Will Byers vanished into shadow to the current crisis of Hawkins' dimensional invasion has traced an arc from mystery to mythology, from a group of kids searching for their friend with flashlights and determination to those same kids, now teenagers bearing scars both visible and invisible, standing against a threat that encompasses multiple dimensions and the accumulated malice of a being who has transcended humanity to become something far more terrifying. Their story, built on foundations of friendship, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when overwhelmed, speaks to persistence as virtue, to the value of standing together even when standing seems futile, to fighting for connection in a world that so often rewards isolation and cruelty. As this chronicle draws to its gentle close, the timeline complete through its current point with threads dangling toward unknown futures, we're left with images that might accompany the drift into sleep. Will's fairy lights spelling messages from beyond, Eleven's bleeding nose as power manifests, Max suspended in Vecna's grip with bones breaking, Billy's sacrifice for a girl who thought she hated him, Hopper's nod before the explosion, Eddie's final question about running away, the Mind Flayer towering over the Dimensions landscape, and the gates pulsing with red light as ash falls over a town that has become ground zero for a war between dimensions. These images, terrible and beautiful, resolve into a truth that the story has consistently reinforced, that horror and hope coexist, that the darkest moments illuminate the brightest acts of courage, and that even in a world where dimensions collide and monsters walk through gates torn in reality, the bonds between people forged in shared struggle and maintained through conscious choice to care despite the cost represent something powerful enough to matter, to fight for, to believe in even when belief seems like the most irrational response to overwhelming darkness. Let these threads of Stranger Things' intricate tapestry carry you now, wherever you're listening, whatever hour holds you, into the space between wake and dreams, where stories become something more than their plots, where timelines dissolve into impressions and feelings, where the journey through decades of fictional horror somehow illuminates truths about resilience, connection, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to the dark, no matter how vast and patient it proves to be.